should be where it ended last time. Any questions from you guys before we start? I feel like we're still a little brighter in here than. Let's see, where were we in the book? Okay. So there's a bit more. Get me bright this early in the morning. All right. So, um, this is where we ended last time with some assistance from Europe, mainly. Prussia, France, Bavaria, Poland, some just individuals coming over and helping out because again everybody kind of hates Britain, so they're joining in. As I said, the main one to worry about from this is mostly Lafayette because he's going to be important throughout the campaign and even after, really. Um, and we also had a number of women here who were involved quite heavily with the war from, well, I mean, in the case of Lydia Dara, like unintentional spycraft. Like she didn't mean to get intelligence on the British, but like they were just there talking about what they were going to do. It's like, well, I guess I'll pass this on. To just straight up shooting the British to just joining the Americans. So, yeah, quite a bit going on as the war progresses. I got images for all that. Meanwhile, back on the home front, things weren't great. Yeah. We had said before that, supplies were not just scarce for the soldiers, but also for, everybody else. So on the home front, things were just as bad. Women working on the farms had to learn to work the fields. Many families had to scavenge or loot to survive. So they would just straight up have to go into towns and like break into shops and such to just get the supplies they needed to survive. Of course, though, the worst time for the home front was when a city would fall either to one side or the other, with women and children often facing violence when it came to the occupying soldiers. Because, as I said, this was war. There were no good guys. Again, if you see any movies from this, about this time period, it's always like, oh, the British were so brutal and evil, but like it was just as bad the other way around. We'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit, but yeah, the British weren't the only ones going in and shooting civilians. So with the, just straight up lack of supplies at this point, not just low supplies. Women would form what were essentially local aid societies. This is something we'll talk more about much later, like next semester later. But basically, they would just produce what they could and share it amongst themselves for whoever needed it in order to survive. It was really just to a point of desperation. It wasn't like before where the families would barter and trade and use what they needed and basically sell what they didn't, they would give whatever extra they had to those that didn't, and in return, if they had if they were desperate, then the others would give to them. Like, it was just pure necessity. This is in the book. This is an image of the British burning down New York City. I'm not sure why, because like New York was kind of their main stronghold, but clearly they decided to put New York to the torch. Or at least part of it. I don't think they ever really burned entire cities down. We'll get to that more towards the end of the semester with the War of 1812. So, when it came to how they were going to govern these colonies and, well, now states, because you can't really be a colony if you're separate from the empire. So in 1777, the Articles of Confederation were drafted and sent to the various states for approval. And somewhere, I can't remember where it was I read this, but maybe I just need to go back and change it on the test because I can't seem to find it ever again. Initially, the Articles of Confederation were... Oh, wait, maybe it's at the beginning of the next chapter. That might be where I saw it. The Articles of Confederation were actually put together like in 1774 by Benjamin Franklin, long before the war even started, but they were only really considered when they were finally drafted in 1777. So obviously this is the time you guys need to know about. But they had been considered for a while. Yeah, Ben Franklin was like the main guy behind this. 8 states ratified this by 1778. It took 3 years before the final state, Maryland, actually ratified the Articles, which we'll get to also in a little bit as to why Maryland was dragging their heels on it. And even before 1776, many states had already kicked out the royal officials, abiding by English common law, or creating their own constitutions. By the way, English common law, if you've ever heard of that, if you've ever taken any, like, England history classes, England doesn't have a constitution per se. They have a collection of many, many, many pieces of law paperwork, I guess you could say, that goes back to at least the 1200s, all the way back to, I think the first one is the Magna Carta that was signed in like 1234 at Runnymede, which was the first document to start to limit the power of the king. And it's just sort of all collected and seen as like the general idea of English common law. There is no single document that's like, this is the Constitution of England, because England is so old and it was gradually built over time. That's what English common law is. It's just like this idea of the law in England. However, creating a constitution is like, okay, well, we're going to take these ideas and like crystallize them into a single document. So many of these reflected this idea of Britain and this concern of the centralized power and how they didn't want the centralized power. So, for example, in Pennsylvania, which was further influenced by Thomas Paine, they enhanced the power of the voters in the legislature and limited the power of the executive branch, which is what we're going to be seeing a lot of going forward. We'll talk more about the Articles of Confederation next chapter. In fact, the whole next chapter is like, the Articles of Confederation suck. We had to make something else. So, we'll get to that later. Virginia also had a Bill of Rights, which are basically anything that wasn't initially in the Constitution, because the Constitution is like a broad thing, and the Bill of Rights are what comes later as like specific rights that people have. So freedom of the press, elections, trial by peers, militias. Others include freedom of speech, bearing arms, equal protection by laws, etc. Because like a lot of these wouldn't be in English common law. New Jersey went a step further, where voting rights were based on property qualifications. So as long as you held property in New Jersey, and it was like a certain level of property, I think it was like worth a certain amount, maybe certain acreage, I don't know. You could vote, which meant that single or widowed women and even free blacks could vote in local and state elections in New Jersey. Now they couldn't. Well, I was going to say they couldn't vote in federal elections. There weren't federal elections yet. But even when there were federal elections, they technically couldn't vote in federal elections because federal elections had a different thing. But still, they could vote in local and state elections, and that was not possible anywhere else. So that was kind of a big deal. Now again, technically, it wasn't that New Jersey was saying, oh yeah, women and just people that aren't white can vote in New Jersey. It's just that the way it was, hey, if you've got this much property, you can vote regardless. So it was just not specifically white men in New Jersey. Needless to say, that gets amended later on. But hey, for a while, New Jersey is like this wild west of people actually having rights. So it's the Articles of Confederation, perpetual union between the states of all of that. There's a whole bunch of Roman numerals in case you want to look at that. I didn't realize they put commas in between them back then, but I guess they did. So, 1778. Obviously, there were differences of opinion when it came to slavery, obviously. Vermont actually outlawed slavery right from the start. From the start, I mean their constitution. So 1777, they're just like, yeah, you know what? We don't need slaves in Vermont, so we're just going to abolish slavery in Vermont. So like all 3 slaves in Vermont were freed. I'm obviously being a little facetious, but that probably wasn't too far from the number of slaves in Vermont. In Pennsylvania, they did a gradual abolition, which was more common. All slaves born after 1780 would be freed once they reached the age of 28, and then any children they had would not be slaves. So no more slavery in Pennsylvania after that point. Massachusetts was kind of a special case. So 2 slaves sued for freedom. The book goes into both cases to a little degree, but a female slave named Mumbet, who later renamed herself Elizabeth Freeman, won her case First, um, so when the other guy brought his case, had his case brought to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's like, hey, we've already looked at this, and so you just automatically win your freedom by precedent. And therefore, that's what the Constitution should be, because slavery is now incompatible with the state constitution. So everybody in Massachusetts is now no longer a slave, which again was like, 5 guys, or 5 people, I should say. Because again, there wasn't a lot of that in Massachusetts. Of course, no state south of Pennsylvania made any move to abolish slavery. And again, I was being a little facetious with the numbers, but not by much, considering 400,000 of the 450,000 slaves were south of Pennsylvania. So, yeah. In the states where they immediately ended slavery, it wasn't freeing that many people. I mean, it's good that the people were freed. Obviously, any amount of slaves being freed is a good thing. But clearly the vast majority are going to be in the states where we got to fight a war over it. Also, the conditions for those who were enslaved grew increasingly worse, because as we had seen, the British had offered freedom to any slaves that fought for them, so Southern slave owners did their best to prevent their slaves from escaping to fight for the British. It was a whole ordeal. Let me just check real quick, make sure that I'm actually broadcasting, because I do not want to be doing all this and then have it be for no reason. And now everybody's here. Let me go to my channel. Yes, okay, good. All right. So, now that said, the British didn't always keep their word. When they would be forced to retreat from areas, they would often just leave those behind that they had claimed they would free. So they would either be recaptured by the Southern slave owners or just straight up killed for attempting to fight back and claim their freedom. Now that said, there were British commanders such as Lord Dunmore, General Sir Henry Clinton, that did do their best to carry some freed slaves with them and give them their freedom. So while there were plenty of cases of them being abandoned, some commanders did stick true to their word. So, while this certainly wasn't while the American Revolution, or as my European history professor likes to put it, the War for American Independence, because the revolution had sort of already happened, it certainly wasn't for the freedom of the slaves. It still hurt the institution of slavery. There were a lot of free black communities that grew in the north, especially around seaport cities, because a lot of the states up north had just abolished slavery or were gradually abolishing slavery, so more and more people were becoming free as the years passed on. And even in the South, there were many slaves that had gained their freedom. However, regardless of all of this, it wasn't considered that big of a deal to the Continental Congress to put it into all of their planning that they were doing. Now, it's not that they weren't thinking about it, because it was a concern among the framers of the Constitution, and well, no, the Constitution comes later. Um, the Continental Congress, all the founding fathers and whatnot, they were thinking about it, but the main issue was more that it couldn't be gotten rid of because of all the power in the slave states that they would basically immediately be starting a civil war with if they tried to get rid of it. So they basically just said, you know what, we're going to put this on the back burner and let people in like 30 years deal with it. So 30 years down the road, it gets brought up again, and they're like, we'll push this back a little bit more. And then eventually we do just end up having a civil war over it. So, yeah. Anywho, here we have the emancipation dates. Again, Vermont, not New Hampshire. New Hampshire was really late. Vermont, just right off the bat, 1777. Actually, New Hampshire, I shouldn't say was really late. New Hampshire became a state really late. It was just like part of, I think Massachusetts there for a while. Massachusetts, also 1780, just like with that, Massachusetts was also this. Maine was a thing later. With that court proceeding, New Hampshire came later, I guess, 1783. And then these were the gradual abolition. New Jersey took a while, but eventually also gradually abolished slavery. And then the Northwest Territories, which we'll get to, I don't even think next chapter. We'll talk about them a little bit this chapter, but later we'll talk about Northwest Territories and how they prohibited slavery right off the start. And then, of course, the slave states just not even considered. So, one of the reasons that the Continental Congress was not focusing too much on the slavery issue is they really needed to get a powerful ally against England. And the main ally they were going for was France. France was like the main power in the world at the time, besides England. Huge financial and military power, and as I've said multiple times since the start of this class, France and England have hated each other since forever. I mean, since literally 1066, if you want to do a little European history there. So, getting an alliance with France wasn't entirely out of the question. I mean, as many times as France has like gone in to help, well, not necessarily sending troops, but has like helped Ireland fight England, and considering Ireland fights England like every 30 years, yeah. Also, like, they literally had a 100 Years' War. Like, in the 1200s to the 1300s, France and England fought for like 100 years. So, they clearly didn't get along. And for France, defeating Britain will be pretty good for them. While they wouldn't necessarily win a lot of land in North America because they weren't winning to take over the colonies, or they weren't fighting to take over the colonies, but it would hurt Britain. It would cost Britain a lot of money, and it would weaken Britain in the continent and allow France to regain some of its footing. But declaring war on another nation, especially a peer nation, because back then the countries were typically pretty equal in power. It's not like today where, America's military is the size of the next 12 militaries put together, and 10 of those militaries are like allied with us. um, Back then, like England and France were pretty close in power. And also France and Spain were usually allied against England, so England would have to fight both of them if they were going to fight one of them. Sure, England had like Prussia, but Prussia was in the middle of the continent. They weren't really having anything to do with all this, and middle. It was going to be a rough fight one way or the other. But because France, they had been smuggling military supplies over to the colonies as early as 1775. So, like, a lot of the guns we were shooting at the British were French guns. That is extremely common in any military conflict against the British. If the British are getting shot at, the guns are usually French, even if the people pulling the trigger are not French. In 1776, the Continental Congress sent Ben Franklin over to France to work on an alliance. Ben Franklin was a very good diplomat. He was very good at talking to people and getting them to see his way of thinking. He was especially good with the French. The French loved him. He about couldn't go home. they really liked him. Granted, he also really liked the French, in particular French women, but that's another story. But it was good that we had him, because the French, as we're going to see a little bit later, kind of looked down on us. But Ben Franklin was a good guy to have. However, it wasn't until the Battle of Saratoga, which I said last time was extremely important for more than just the fact that we won it, that France was willing to talk about an alliance. Because, again, sure, France is all about fighting Britain, but they need to have some idea that they might win, because if they go to fight England again and lose, they're just throwing money and bodies at nothing. Because we just had the 7 Years' War, a decade or two before, and France got whipped. France got absolutely destroyed and lost almost everything in North America. So they weren't really keen on going back to war with England, especially if there was no chance they'd win. So helping with the rebellion, which meant that they wouldn't probably get much of anything, especially a rebellion that wasn't going well, they weren't too keen on it. But after the victory at Saratoga, where our generals did really, really well against what should have been superior forces, France was like, okay, yeah, you guys are doing okay. We'll throw our weight behind you and help out. So immediately, Britain declared war on France and Spain, because again, Spain was France's ally, which moved the war from just North America to another global conflict. They were fighting in Gibraltar, West Africa, and the West Indies. So once again, Britain is fighting kind of everywhere. Not so much in India anymore, because Britain had basically wiped out France from that area. Of course, though, this also meant that Britain had to spend a lot more money fighting this war. So when it had been spending £4 million in 1775 when the war started, by the time the war ended, they were spending £20 million a year in 1782. So, yeah, going from fighting a couple of colonies on the east coast of North America to fighting some colonies and also well, I shouldn't say two major world powers because Spain isn't really a major world power anymore. France and also Spain. Um, it makes things a lot more expensive. So from France, we had officers, weapons, funds, and a navy because we didn't really have a navy. I showed you guys that map with Boston. We had like some pirates, I guess, but that's not really a navy. Um, Meanwhile, Spain used New Orleans as a port for privateers, which is to say, pirates. Um, and also pushed up from Florida, even though technically they had given Florida to Britain, they still had forces in Florida. Britain didn't have time to consolidate Florida yet. So all of this sudden surge from what were Britain's two major European rivals forced the British to pull back from pretty much all the colonies and withdraw to New York as their stronghold. So New York State, New York City mostly, was like the final major bastion of British forces. And it never really fell. I mean, the war was won outside of New York, and it was over, and they eventually left. But like, we never took New York from the British. And then I found this fantastic gif of American colonists fighting for independence, and the French are like, "Yeah, that's nice." It's like, "Well, we're fighting the British." The French are like, "Oh, okay, yeah, we'll help out." Sounds like a great time. Violence against the Brits is our bread and butter. So anyway. Yeah, here we go. There's a picture in the book of Washington's French allies. Shows Washington and his generals at Yorktown, the site of the final major battle. Among Washington's generals were the Frenchmen, the Marquis de Lafayette, which I've already told you guys about, and Comte de Rochambeau, which is also a pretty famous guy. Peel was not at Yorktown, but fought in the Continental Army for 3 years. So yeah, Peel was also there. Okay. There was, however, a slight problem with France getting involved, and that was that a lot of the Continental forces, the American citizens, were like, "Okay, cool, we don't have to volunteer anymore because we've got France on our side, so they can go die instead of us." So we have fewer volunteers fighting in Washington's army. And there was a reason for that. We were losing a lot of guys, and it wasn't so much in battle. So as the war was going on, men were captured. They were prisoners in New York or in prison ships, which I mentioned back when we were talking about, like, in England, where they would just moor ships off the coast and fill it full of prisoners, which was super unsanitary. So we had about between 8,000 and 11,500 prisoners die in these military prisons, which was more than we had dying in combat. You had a better chance of dying after being captured than you did on the battlefield in the Revolutionary War. You were safer being shot at than you were surrendering to the British. And not because they would shoot you afterwards, because the prisons were just that bad. And it wasn't because, like, specifically the British would, like, starve you or beat you or, like, mistreat you. It's just the prisons at that time were that unsanitary, and you would just like get some disease and die. So as far as the Continental Congress, they were still dealing with a lot. They couldn't raise funds because they didn't have the power to actually tax the colonies. Um, they took loans from France, the Netherlands, and patriots who had money to give them loans. They did print paper money in the colonies. They were known as Continentals, and they very quickly became worthless. 100 Continentals was required to buy a single silver dollar by 1780. So, quick aside here. When I was in grad school, I got a part-time job as a research assistant for one of the professors there. And basically, I was just helping them, like, gather up sources for one of the books they were writing. And one of them was basically doing, like, Revolutionary era, post-Revolutionary era economics in America. And there was so much about, like, this paper money. I mean, they called it, like, the devil money. They hated it. Because, and I'll do like I did with my other class, when you have paper money, so I'll just go ahead and do here. Here's a 10 and here's a 1. What's the difference in the value of a $10 bill and a $1 bill? Like, literally. Well, yeah, but, like, they're both paper. What's the intrinsic value? Like, if that had a gold coin and a silver coin, well, but what it's made of. Gold's rare. Gold's harder to get. Gold's therefore worth more. There's just an extra zero on this piece of paper that makes it worth 9 times as much. Well, 10 times as much. But paper money is actually not worth anything. It's worth a promise that there's that much money in gold or silver somewhere in a vault that the government says is there. These are banknotes. Yeah, Federal Reserve note says at the top. This is a IOU from the government that says we have this much in gold or silver somewhere that we promise is worth it, and that's what paper money is. And back then, they didn't trust it. And since the people didn't trust it, the value dropped real hard. So within a few years, it took 100 of these to buy one silver dollar. So paper money went out of style real fast. It took a long time to actually make paper money stick. And a lot of people still don't really trust paper money. Like, that's still a thing, by the way. Don't even get me started on, like, digital only. People are really not happy about that. In fact, there were riots in Philadelphia in 1779 over high prices and low wages. In October, militiamen joined, which is usually a bad sign for anybody that's not wanting the government to be overthrown. Because typically when, like, the army or the police join the protest, it's over. It's done. The protests have won. They marched on the house of James Wilson, who was a lawyer that sided with the merchants. This lasted for hours, but eventually 15 militiamen were arrested, but they did later distribute food. So the war's not over yet. But things are getting so desperate in the colonies, people are rioting over lack of food and prices being raised in the colonies when people don't have any money. And again, the money being essentially worthless. Um, so we did finally kind of level out finances. There was a $6 million loan from France. So these certificates of the Patriots, which is to say again paper money, now at least had some money that it was based on. Granted, it was French money, and it was French money that was loaned to us, but it was money. So they used the states could tax their people. The Continental Congress couldn't, but each state could do their own little state taxes because we have today state taxes and federal taxes. Back then, they couldn't do federal taxes because there wasn't a federal anything yet. But each state could do taxes. But even the most fervent patriots weren't too happy about this because that was kind of the point of the war. But very quickly, they discovered that you kind of need taxes to run a government. So the whole rah, we're gonna be a government without taxes kind of fell through. I mean, that wasn't ever gonna be what it was, but some of the people who were involved in the war were really starry-eyed, oh, we're gonna be a country without taxes. No, you can't do that. That's not how it works. So here we have a Continental $20 bill. Now, again, historically, this is probably worth a lot now. But back then, in 1775, or I guess by 1780, it wouldn't have been worth the paper it was printed on. Here is the riot in Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia specifically. Dude's getting shanked. It's rough. There's a lot going on. And this is another one of these images where there's a lot happening. It looks like this dude's pulled a lamppost out of the ground and he's about to smack this guy with a lamppost. This lady's tackled a guy. But there's stuff going on back here. I always focus back here. I don't have any background of this image besides this is the Philadelphia riots. It looks to me like she's being lifted out of a window. I feel like they're going on a romantic tryst, which is to say there's an affair going on. Because, there's a stagecoach right here, and he's lifting her out the window. However, there's other stuff happening as well. Does anyone know what this is? Anyone know what's happening here? Oh, it's not tea. No. No. It maybe used to be tea or gravy. Does anyone know what a chamber pot is? So, I'm glad you said that. I get to explain what a chamber pot is. They didn't have internal plumbing back then. Yeah, you pooped in a pot and you dumped it out the window. And yeah, you just chucked it out a window, and sucks for anybody walking by below. So yeah, that's also why I don't know how much it's common knowledge anymore, but when a couple's walking down the street, the woman's supposed to walk closer to the buildings, and the man's supposed to walk by the road, because stuff like this, most buildings had awnings, and so the woman will be normally walking in the awning. So if people were chunking crap out the window, sometimes literally, it was more likely to hit the guy than the lady in her nice dress, because typically, especially during this time period and before, in the Victorian era, guys would have those big stovepipe hats, which were also meant to catch ashes from trains when you'd be riding the train, because you weren't just getting smoke from the trains. There would be live ashes flying out of those trains, and that the hats were meant to protect your head from getting caught, catching on fire. Yeah, you'd at least hopefully not fully get covered in stuff. Yeah, that's what some of these old traditions come from, is this era of people just literally throwing garbage out of their windows. Cities were awful. And I guess I'll bring this up as well because I brought it up from another class. So needless to say, they didn't have any car pollution back then. No like air pollution from cars, because they had carriages and stagecoaches and stuff. They had a different kind of pollution. What pulls the coaches and such? Yeah, what do horses leave? And it got bad. The big cities that were really, really full of people, and therefore full of horses, sometimes roads would become impassable. And then it would rain, and it would just become like quicksand. I've got a picture. I've got to find it. It's in a different slide than what I use for these classes, where there's like one of these carts, and it's buried up to the axle. Yeah, that was one of the reasons we moved to motor transit. Anyway, something else going on. Let's see. Oh, yes. So Congress also wanted to settle land claims in the West and also build relations with the native nations. But doing both of those were difficult because by doing one, they would fail the other. Because by settling land claims, they piss off the natives. Because settling land claims means taking land from the natives, essentially. Because Patriot leaders were pretty open about the fact that if they succeeded in becoming independent from Britain and weren't just, killed for treason, they would expand further into the West, because the whole proclamation line of 1763 or whatever, that was a British line. And if we defeated Britain and we were therefore no longer part of Britain, that line did not count. So in the South, there was a lot of fighting between the Patriots and the Cherokees, largely due to attacks by the Cherokee chief Dragon Canoe. Meanwhile, his sister, Nancy Ward, or Nanyi He, was more sympathetic to the Patriot cause, so there was a lot of internal struggle with that. That could be a whole lesson in itself. I've not really researched too much into that, but that sounds like there would be a lot to that. So that's pretty interesting. Meanwhile, and this is a whole thing. I've got a map for this. It's just weird. A lot of states had already claimed a bunch of land to the west, because again, as we've talked about with the 7 Years' War, the idea was once the war's over, the people who fought in the war can go and take this land as their reward. Because the main thing was get a bunch of land, build a nice big farm, and live out your life farming. That was the dream. Maryland, though, was not able to make any claims. For one thing, they're completely isolated on the East Coast. They don't have any land touching the frontier. Now, granted, there are some other states that aren't touching the frontier, but they still made land claims because reasons. But they were real touchy about it. They're like, well, we're not going to agree to the Articles of Confederation until these lands are made common property for Congress to parcel out into free and independent governments. Basically, thank God for Maryland, because if it wasn't for Maryland, our states would be really awful. We would have, our East Coast states would just be stretched all the way to the Mississippi. Yeah, it's. I will show you guys. It's real terrible. New York ceded its claims to Continental Congress. Connecticut, Massachusetts followed suit, and then the other states did as well. Maryland finally signed the articles or ratified the Articles of Confederation. But of course, it was this promise of using the Western lands for the benefit of the United States that meant we were going to be fighting the natives for a while. And by for a while, I mean well into next semester. So, yeah. It's like, oh, we're going to use this for the common good of America. It's like, not for the people who have been here longer than us. Here's that awful map. Just stretch. Look at this. Look at this claim South Carolina made. What is that? Georgia's kind of makes sense. Florida's makes sense. North Carolina's makes the most sense. It's just Tennessee. Virginia's was going to be Kentucky. That makes sense. But then you start looking at these other lines. New York claims all of this. Virginia also claims all of this. And then you've got these over here. It's like, okay, Massachusetts is this bit of Maine and also this bit. And, well, I guess that's not Maine. I don't know. These states up here don't count. And Connecticut, which is over here, claims this bit. And that's like, what is wrong with you guys? So, yeah. I'm real glad Maryland was like, yeah, let's do something different. This is bad. That said, these states, even though I've been across them, well, I say twice, 4 times, I guess, back and forth. Even though I've been across these states several times now, it's still all just a blur. So it might as well be just a blob. Anyway, here is probably this is probably a children's book based on the art and just the language of it. Nancy Ward, her cry was all for peace. Dragon Canoe, we are not yet conquered. So yeah, again, I imagine there's probably a lot of real good story behind that, but alas, we've got a lot to go over. All right, let's move a little further along so that we will only have a little bit left for next time, and then we can do the study guide and the test next week. All right. So regardless of who claimed what, there was still a lot of fighting going on in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, which, again, land claims don't mean jack, especially in a war. The British forces and their native allies were attacking the Spanish troops and American settlers in largely the Ohio River Valley. I must say Ohio Mississippi Valley. I don't know. So we didn't have that many people over there, and we certainly didn't have that many actual troops over there. So we didn't have a very good response, but it worked. This is another one that I feel like we could really go into because it sounds like a hell of a story. Um, we had George Rogers Clark, who was just like a surveyor from Virginia, just a dude that like goes out and surveys land and prepares it for being divvied up and you know made for cities or townships or even just like farms or whatever. Um, he countered native raids in the West to reinforce the French and Spanish allies, and then led a surprise attack at Vincennes, which was like a British fort, and ended up defeating the British there. Just this dude, just this guy from from Virginia ended up leading this attack um, that took like a major British fort. So yeah, go George Rogers Clark. Um, the British managed to keep Detroit, which cool, I guess. Um, the Spanish did defeat a large attack on St. Louis, which meant that the Americans still had control over the Ohio River Valley, because again, St. Louis is on really kind of the fork of, if I remember right, it's the fork of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. And you really want to have a major fortification on that point, a major hold on that point. So the Spanish had a good hold there. So thanks, Spain. I make fun of Spain. They at least did a good job here. Meanwhile, General John Sullivan was doing a real good job of just murdering natives. Led troops against the Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga villages, which, regardless of whether or not they were actually fighting us, they were still having their villages burned down and people massacred, including the Delaware, who had converted to Christianity and declared themselves neutral. They were also slaughtered because reasons. Needless to say, conflict between the natives and American forces would not end when the revolution ended. But for the moment, the Americans, along with the French and Spanish, held on to the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Well, really, till the end of the war. We do end up having some issue with the Spanish later on over like the control of Mississippi, but it's short-lived. Because then France ends up getting Louisiana back, and they were like, hey, France, can we pay for this? They're like, hey, you can just have the whole damn thing. We don't need it anymore. So there is George Rogers Clark. I mean, again, very, like, well-kept British troops versus these, like, woodsman bumpkins. But yeah, that's what we had, and we did it somehow. There's the attack on St. Louis. I guess apparently they used to have like a straight up, like a castle tower almost. That's a hell of a thing. I mean, I know they've got the arch now, but that castle tower is pretty cool. And then we've got a plaque for Major General John Sullivan, what murdered lots of natives. And there he is. What a hero. Man, those you never know. Those kids might fire a cannon at us or something. Anyway. Oh yeah, okay. Meanwhile, the British were still able to push south. They captured Savannah in 1778, took control of Georgia. Um, the southern states were not very heavily populated, so it was quite easy for the British to take them. Also, we were, I wouldn't say strongholds for the Loyalists, but we did have quite a few Loyalists down here in the South. Um, so the British came rolling in. It wasn't that big of a fight for them. So General Clinton was called north. Lord Charles Cornwallis was left with Savannah. He then made his way up to Charleston in 1780. Loyalists ran through South Carolina and, did what Loyalists do, besides drinking tea. We had a fellow named Banastre Tarleton, who slaughtered civilians as well as surrendered patriots, which led to our guy, Thomas Sumter, who is this great hero for slaughtering Loyalist civilians because, they're the bad guys. It's very funny. I mean, it's not funny, but it's like you hear. Now, you guys might not have heard of either of these guys, but in the various American histories I've taken over the years, Banastre Tarleton is said with the same sort of venom as you would say, like, I don't know, Emperor Palpatine or something. And then Thomas Sumter was like, oh, well, he was just doing what he had to do. He was a great hero. They did the same thing. It was just opposite sides of the war. Yeah. So, by the way, also, have you ever seen the movie The Patriot? Good old Mel Gibson. Thomas Sumter is one of the historic characters that inspires the character he's playing. Because he does just straight up shoot British troops that have surrendered. And the rest of his guys are like, what are you doing? He's like, oh, they did that. He's like foaming at the mouth. I don't think that was in the script. That might have just been Mel Gibson. Meanwhile, General Gates marched south to help the Continentals, but was defeated by Cornwallis at Camden. This is also around the same time that Benedict Arnold's betrayal was discovered. By the way, the book doesn't really go much into the whole Benedict Arnold thing, so I'll briefly give you guys a summary. Benedict Arnold was, during the early part of the war, like George Washington's number 2 man. Like, he was right there doing, like, all these big things with General Washington. And I don't remember if it was specifically with the French coming in and Lafayette becoming important, or if it was just a gradual thing over time. But gradually he started getting less and less important assignments, and then just like got put in garrison duty, which is like, it's garrison duty for a general, especially someone who had been leading victories in the war, is basically like being made to do busy work because they don't want to fire you, or they can't fire you. So he was getting real sore about this. And the woman he was seeing was a loyalist. Like, she was just straight up giving information to the British. And so she convinced him that, his talents are wasted on the Americans, and the British would treat him better, and blah, blah, blah. So eventually, he did finally betray the Americans. He was, now granted, the fort that he was watching, garrison duty, was like this extremely important fort that controlled the mouth of the Albany River, I believe? Hudson River. It's right, the York City is now. Big deal. Granted, he didn't have like a whole regiment mutiny with him, so his betrayal didn't last very long. He had to get out and like retreat to England. And then the English were like, "Oh, you're the guy that betrayed your fellow countrymen. Well, we don't want anything to do with you." So he just like died sad and alone. But like the main thing about Benedict Arnold's betrayal was it really hurt Washington. He was distraught that like this guy that he considered his friend, almost his brother, would betray him over this. So that was the whole Benedict Arnold thing. I know you have heard the name and you know that he did a betrayal, but that's the background. Anyway, Ferguson troops were out at Kings Mountain. General Nathaniel Greene went south to replace Gates. He used the tactics of Daniel Morgan and Francis Marion. Of course, Francis Marion being the guy that my college is named after. These were guerrilla tactics. These were not stand in a line and get shot tactics. These were hit and fade, hide behind trees, destroy supply lines. And if you've ever been outside here in South Carolina, you know we've got a lot of trees. There's plenty of places to hide, and especially the further east you go, it gets swampy. There's lots of places to hide. So they really ran the British ragged. So there was a British Patriot victory at Cowpens, which was real bad for the British. And while the British technically won at Guilford Courthouse, they suffered such bad losses they had to retreat. While they technically won, but then they had to get out of the South. They made their way up to Yorktown, Virginia, to hunker down and await for reinforcements from General Clinton up in New York. Unfortunately for them, the French were around, but we'll get to that next time. So, real quick, I believe this is Charleston being taken by the British. And there is Tarleton. And this is probably Sumter. And then the various battles here. So this would be Camden, the Continentals defeated. This is Cowpens, no, Kings Mountain. This is Cowpens. The British being defeated in a surprisingly organized manner. And then Guilford Courthouse with the Americans being defeated, but the British suffering quite a bit of losses in this battle. All right. So we only have a few slides left. We will finish up next time, and then next week we'll do the study guide, and then Wednesday will be the test. So I'll see you guys, well, this coming Wednesday for the rest of the notes. I think the third test might just be the final, considering we're almost in November now. So yeah, that's how I usually end up doing.